was taking a look at this piece of information where apparently there is some censorship that's happening amongst the various different chat programs that are out there. So this one specifically is talking about what happened with Kamala Harris when she had started to deal with some nonviolent drug offenders, I think. And what occurred was they started keeping them in jail or doing some things that the DA was apparently not supposed to do. And she said that they did that because they needed to have them help fight fires or something like that. And so a bunch of the links that were returned by ChatGPT, according to this person, are no longer visible. So some amount of posts have been taken down that documented that situation. And then there was another thing that came out additionally that I think Elon Musk was talking about as well, which is that there's certain amounts of information about the assassination attempt on July 13th that are being scrubbed out. And so if you put the words together, Trump and assassination, apparently that doesn't yield anything interesting anymore.
And it's not even suggested. I put a post up earlier this morning because I went to Google I mean, it's not just an AI. I mean, maybe AI is driving the search results for Google's search right now, but I think it's more so that that for some reason companies have an interest in burying information about the assassination attempt. Maybe it's because they want to quell emotional viewers or people looking for, I don't know, emotionally hot topics. I didn't know that the information about Kamala Harris's what she said, and I remember going back to the primaries for 2020, was that California needed the incarcerated people to be working for for picking up trash in ditches and I forget what, but this
Fighting fires. That was the other one. Fighting fires.
Fighting fires. Well,
Yeah.
and that's exactly who you want to be going out and fighting fires, and that's exactly how we should be fighting forest fires.
Well, hey, wait a minute. I mean, you can't keep people in jail and then make them fight fires. Like, what? What is going on here?
I was being a little sarcastic there. I mean, I was
know. I was just playing into it. Like, can you do that? Can you keep people in jail to fight fires?
I mean, and I mean, even going to the forest fires, which I've seen that there's another fire in Northern California that's blowing up right now. But part of our, just on a side note, our response to fighting forest fires is a joke. The way that you fight forest fires is to manage the material that can catch on fire before it catches on fire, because once the canopy of the forest starts to go, it's not like you can do anything. Except maybe save a couple of houses with lots of fire retardant and millions and millions and millions of dollars in air tanker contracts. And I doubt any of those prisoners were flying a 737 with flame retardant pumped into it. But
yeah, you gotta do proper forest management. You gotta get out there and clear brush and do a bunch of stuff ahead of time, ahead of fire season. You can't just wait until it starts burning and then spray chemicals. Like, that doesn't
right.
the right way.
And it seems that we get further and further and further from that notion of managing the forest. I'm not against seeing incarcerated people working, doing physical labor. I don't know. If I were in prison, I would probably appreciate getting out and doing something physical rather than the monotony of being in a cell all day. But I don't know a lot about what else was going on with Kamala and the California Corrections Institute. I'm more so.
Fortunately, that information has been scrubbed off the internet, so you can't search for it. You also cannot get a link from ChatGPT. So unless you can find a link to it on X or somebody saved that article off on like the Wayback Machine, you can no longer read about it.
I mean, thank goodness we are not burdened by what has been.
Yes, we are now unburdened. This is the what it looks like to be unburdened as the process of the unburdening begins.
Uh, and now if we could just fix the Supreme Court and also be unburdened by what has been there, then will be on our pathway um, to a monarchy.
Well, not to
So
beat a dead horse, but I'm going to get my stick out here. Um, X is the only place to get information anymore. Uh, so I saw this kind of came across this that Pete Souza, said something about the ear, and then account was deleted and some other stuff. This isn't the particular post that I think was the best that documented this, but I believe some people have said this photo is from a while ago. Like this is not a recent photo. Do you hear this story at all?
no, so what claim is he making here with this photo of Trump's ear?
That there's no bullet hole, that he didn't get shot in the ear, that
Uh,
was all fake and made up. So he posted this photo, deletes his account off X, and then some people were like, "Oh no, Elon did that," and there's like a big flap about whether Trump actually got shot in the ear or not, which is this whole assassination thing. But if you go digging for this information on X, you can actually like see a discussion and talking about what actually happened, and then you get the moderator comments in there.
isn't it amazing to see a conspiracy plot thicken I mean not unravel but ravel right before our eyes.
It's
Um,
it's crazy because I remember watching that story. I remember how it was reported when it was first happening, and you can see it slowly just like getting morphed in cyberspace. And the thing is, if you weren't there during that initial thing and something didn't get loaded into your head, or you didn't shoot a video of you interacting on social media, you wouldn't have the context for like what it was like to be there that day. You can no longer do that kind of thing. Like you can't go back and experience what happened before in any reasonable way like we used to. I mean, it was before that you would get this radio broadcast and everybody got it and it could be recorded and then you would have history. Now we all have these private feeds and they're all potentially different and they're mutable over time. So you don't even can't even go back and see what you were looking at because things keep shifting around. Like, did he get shot or did he not get shot? If Google says he didn't, I guess it didn't happen.
well, it was also amazing at how immediate the various narratives began growing from that incident. You know, not just like the through fair narrative of who was Trump, what was his campaign about going into that, but to what happened. I mean, even the to add on top of that um, the events that were happening on the Democratic ticket with regards to uh, Biden's removal. I don't even want to say stepping down. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Seymour Hersh article that exposes that Obama or reveals that Obama called Biden and said that Kamala was willing and ready to invoke the 25th Amendment.
I saw that.
Pretty unbelievable. Um, but yeah, and it's remember whenever we thought
I
if
wonder if we should pull that up. Hold on. Like, let's not blow past that. Give me a second. I'll throw something on the screen.
well go ahead and pull it up and I'll continue to wax poetically. Um, there was I mean, like, go back to the Zapruder film and JFK. You would think that getting something on film would alleviate concerns, but what it does is just like open up people to more possibilities for an insertion of the narrative that they want to see. Was there somebody on the grassy knoll? Was there somebody on the water tower? What was the
And
motivation?
that directly relates to the exact kind of a thing that was happening with the Trump situation, where he got shot in the assassination attempt. You've got Thomas Crooks. He's allegedly the patsy that's sitting there. The shot that was taken 554 yards versus 384. You got multiple shooter theory. You have bullet holes going through people that are at completely at the wrong angle from where Thomas Crooks was supposedly laying, that he couldn't have possibly made that shot. Yeah, it's a lot of wild stuff. The investigation into what the Secret Service was doing, it's happening right before our eyes in real time.
And we can never know what truth and reality are, but this is also why I'm wary of falling in love with politicians. Um, I think it's much more important to track what the policies are and how those are changing, and identify with the things that you want to see the most, and think of it in a through line of how that's going, because lost in the removal of Biden and an attack on Trump is the fact that their policies are almost exactly the same, and they're both responsible for inflation.
Well,
And
hey, but before we get to that, because I think that that is a great segue into what I wanted to talk about with some of the speeches that got recorded and presented at Bitcoin Nashville. Let me say one thing about an author, because sometimes we talk about books, and this one came to mind in this whole internet thing. I think Neil Stephenson is one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time. I'm just going to throw that out there. Like, I would say what he writes, as far as its predictive capacity and its forward thinkingness, this guy has thrown out ideas that are up there with the greatest science fiction authors of all time. I'm talking Asimov and Heinlein and everybody. So this guy is a living treasure, and he wrote a book that talks about kind of all of this internet stuff, and it's in Seven Eves. And what happens in Seven Eves is you have this cloud fleet in space, and they use this cloud fleet to try and escape the catastrophe on the planet Earth. And what happens is it's really hard to move stuff around in space. Like, it costs you mass. The only way to move in space is to throw something in the other direction. And so to achieve that, you have to have water, you have to have ice. And so the entire economy and book is about how they're managing their water and what they're doing, and how this cloud arc works. And because it's so hard to move around, they mostly talk to each other on the internet. So they have an internet of computers that are all networked together in this cloud arc. And so a lot of what we're talking about is things that he envisioned. It was like, well, how would you manage and police yourself in cyberspace? And he brings up a bunch of the topics that we're sort of dealing with now, where you can deep fake things, and you can have problems with misinformation campaigns, and you can have people get into big disagreements, and revisionist history. It's a lot of stuff is all contained in 70 of. So it's a pretty cool book, and I highly recommend him as an author.
I've never read any Neil Stephenson, but now he's now on my radar. And I'll give Seven Eves a listen at some point.
Yeah, it's this one, and if you get the right version of it on audiobook, it's fantastic. Really well done.
Well, I might have to ask you for that reader on the backside sometime.
Right on. Okay, well, should we talk about
Let's
the Bitcoin Nashville?
Yeah, let's talk about those speeches.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw this out there. The speech that Kennedy gave, in my opinion, is one of the most fantastic pieces of political speech that I've heard in recent days. And when I was first trying to listen to it on C-SPAN, I think was where I first found it. It was so echoey and garbly that I could barely make out what was being said, which I thought was just an absolute shame. So I took a few hours and meticulously went through and transcribed the entire speech, and here it is. So it's very long. There's a lot of content in here, and if you don't have time to listen for 45 minutes and you're frustrated with the audio, you can give it a quick read through. It's not that hard to read it. It doesn't take that long, but I think it's a very impactful piece of political speech, and it shows that Robert Kennedy has a very strong grasp of Bitcoin and what Bitcoin means. And I think, Lucas, the criticisms that you've had about how do we judge Bitcoin and whether the price relative to USD is really the thing that's important, and how do you measure the success of something like Bitcoin. And he draws strong parallels between Bitcoin and the freedoms and liberties that we want to have in America, like canonically, what we would consider to be freedom and liberty. And so he talks about the freedom to transact, the freedom to be safe in your papers, digital property rights, and he goes through an extensive set of grievances that he's got related to both Biden and Trump, related to their violations of the Constitution and various amendments. I thought it was just an awesome, awesome speech.
His the portion of it in which he dug into sort of the systematic perversion of the Bill of Rights by Biden and Trump specifically, I thought was the best part of it. But just going back to what you said, and one, thank you for transcribing the speech and posting it.
Well, hey, one other section I'm going to call out that we actually have talked about on this show is SoftWar. I think we talked about it.
We have to talk about that, but not yet. Oh my god.
But it's in there, you know. I mean, if you don't listen to the entire speech and you don't know what he's talking about, this does not come through. Like, you don't really understand what he's talking about because you don't know that he's even mentioning this. It was like the only reason I knew what he was talking about was because I actually have a copy of SoftWar, which has also been scrubbed off the internet, by the way.
Well, and to scrubbed, I don't think that it is a mistake that that it's very difficult to find the Bobby Kennedy Jr Bitcoin 2024 speech on YouTube as opposed to Trump. You know, I went and typed Bobby Kennedy Bitcoin speech, and guess what my top results were?
It had to be Trump, yeah.
Trump speech. And then to go and listen to, I believe it was a Forbes account had Bobby Kennedy's speech, and the audio was
that's what I'm talking about. Like, that was the problem. Like, the audio is so garbled, you can barely understand what's being said. And when I went to try and pull all the automatic transcripts, they were all wrong. There were big chunks of the speech were missing. The words were way off. I mean, I had to turn the speed of the video down to as slow as it could go and basically do the text to speech myself because there was so much problems with the text to speech because of how his voice sounds. Like, I think just the AI isn't trained in a way that it can properly do text to speech, so it just destroys all the text. It was really bad. This was actually a really hard thing to do. It like, I had to do it almost completely manually.
Well, again, bravo. Okay, let's go to the different aspects of the speech, and maybe we want to start with.
Well, let's start with just his command of Bitcoin. I think as a reaction to this speech, like, there is not a stone unturned here with respect to what Bitcoin can do and making a stump speech for it, right? If you think about some of the things he says with respect to Bitcoin, he says it's most important that it's decentralized and self-sovereign. If you can't own it directly, it undermines it and it hands control to people like BlackRock and the global asset managers. He just calls them straight out. He just says it. It's wild. Here, let me see if I can find that part.
And he does say that, but
right there.
There's also this notion that the most concerning notion that I'm hearing with the narrative with regards to Bitcoin is that holding Bitcoin as a strategic asset reserve or using it in lieu or partnered with gold, silver, other assets to be the basis of a fiat currency does absolutely nothing for limiting the ability of banks and politicians to stretch and adulterate that currency. And that's the part that I very much worry about, because if and not only that, but the notwithstanding like the ability to self-custody Bitcoin and to use it as a financial asset for which no government can come to you and take it from you. But how does, if we're moving the basis of the dollar or fiat currencies onto something that nobody controls, then I mean, like, look at the narrative of Chinese owning land in the United States. If the Chinese own Bitcoin and we move the basis of our fiat currency to Bitcoin, then they can do whatever they want. And that's where I get very worried about, like, especially having our presidential leaders to be excited about turning the United States dollar into something that we no longer control.
I don't think he's talking about that. That's not what Kennedy's talking about. Kennedy is saying that he's read what Lowry wrote, and he understands that Bitcoin is like gunpowder. That, like, I don't know. Did you see that section where he talks about that?
Well, absolutely. And but even then, I'm worried. I don't agree with Lowry and SoftWar. I don't agree with that notion that I mean, yes, I do agree with the understanding of Bitcoin as being something novel with regards to communication. But with with the introduction of evaluation in dollars and the role that it's taken in being the signal, or the role that it's taking as being sort of the benchmark that we gauge the inflation of the United States dollar and the currency base, not just the price inflation, but the actual, like, number of dollars that have been printed, is to me what is its most important use is. And I do see blockchain technology as accomplishing some of the things that Lowry talks about, but if it's done at the price basis that Bitcoin has already achieved, then the real losers are going to be blue collar, assetless people who exist throughout the world, and especially in America.
All right. Well, I think what they're talking about and what is being discussed pretty extensively and has already been demonstrated, I think, by Van Eck. I don't know if you saw this one, but this is worth mentioning at this point, because we're talking about what is the use of Bitcoin, right? And how is it going to be used? So in this speech, he talks about Bitcoin as a certain type of power, and he likens it to gunpowder, and that there's going to be a global race for Bitcoin and to use it as an asset for which debt can be created. And I think it's that concept, and is talked about, by these guys, that they're planning on doing this. This is Cantor Fitzgerald, and their CEO said they're going to offer a Bitcoin lending product. This is how we're going to end up with some kind of a U.S.-based currency. It's based on debt backed by assets.
Well, it seems to me that it's going to be an international currency, and it's going to allow those people who are the holders of that Bitcoin, or the holder of that currency, to go and move anywhere and do whatever they want.
Well, this is the next version of USDC. So right now, and this probably gets into, like, just stable coins, and we've been meaning to do a show just specifically on stable coins. We probably need to do that.
Well, and Bobby,
this foreshadows it.
And sure. Did not Bobby Kennedy mention stable coins, or was it Trump that mentioned stable coins? Because I'm partially conflating.
Kennedy was talking about stable coins through first principles and through, like, how he wanted to create the dollar. He is essentially talking about a stable coin.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Kennedy had entire chunks of his speech, but he didn't use the word stable coin even once. He didn't call it that.
Well,
he just said the US dollar, and it's like he's re-envisioning the US dollar. He's talking about either changing the relationship of the Fed to the United States and how they want to issue currencies.
I mentioned before the show when we were talking that I visited a museum in Folsom, New Mexico yesterday. An interesting thing that took me aback while I was there was at the museum and the museum was in the location of a very old building there. And apparently, at one point, they had been in the business of printing United States dollars there. And the only thing that they needed in order to get the printer from the United States government to print dollars was you had to have a safe in which to hold gold. And you know, I talk obliquely, and I don't want to go too deeply into it, but about the creation of the national banking system. And part of the way that it was created was that it made paper currency to be disseminated through, you know, the retail and commercial interests throughout the nation. But the gold dust was reserved for the payment of holding onto gold by banking institutions. And the problem that arose was that in the end, the financial organizations, the bankers, were the ones who held all of the gold.
Well, there's a parallel to that in what's being proposed here. And if you look at Yep. So if you look at that thing we just mentioned, which is Cantor Fitzgerald, they're essentially saying they want to go back to that same kind of a setup. Is there would be a custodial or some kind of a smart contract relationship that would be established with your Bitcoin, and that something would be created that you would use as the currency under which you're transacting normally, but that there's this smart contract that encumbers your Bitcoin. And that discussion of how that would work is detailed here in the Kennedy speech. And he talks about how he wants to strengthen the US dollar. Now, at this point, I think it's thinking about the US dollar as it is right now, but the way that he describes this strengthening of the US dollar can only be the creation of a new currency. The way he talks about it working, the way he talks about it being digital, it can only be done through some sort of an interaction with the Bitcoin chain, and with that having a strong blockchain component to it. So this essentially describes a stablecoin. This is the only thing it can describe. And then he likens it to what happened with JFK and what he was doing in creating a currency that was backed by silver.
That I also thought was very interesting. You know, another thing that RFK did that really lost me is that he talks about Nixon, and he says Nixon took the United States out of gold. That's not what Nixon did. And that's part of what very, very much worries me about his understanding.
You know what we need to do? We have to get Kennedy on this show so he can talk to you about the situation with Nixon. That would be awesome.
I mean, I would a dream come true because he's on the right path.
We did a show completely about that, so we could post it at him and be like, here, you should listen to this and learn about what happened with Nixon.
Don't repeat the mistakes of your father and your uncle and countless of other politicians, because we need to be very wary about creating a class system in which financiers have access to assets that retail and consumer customers and the average citizen don't have access to. Because that's part of the problem that we've seen in the world today. And if we're just recreating the same system that we've seen before and supplanting gold or supplanting gold with Bitcoin, then we are going to have some of the same problems. And this is also where we need a politician to begin to break into the unholy alliance of C, B, D, and C. And to realize that there are concepts in those four acronyms, and each of those words in that acronym speak to a value in an alliance and an understanding of how to run a country through money. And there's really only one unholy one in there anymore, and that's the centralized aspect. So if our politicians can begin to start grappling with these notions of self-custody and of stable algorithmic flexibility in a currency based to an asset, but get away from this notion of requiring a centralized authority, then they're going to be back, like back in the ethos of blockchain and the ethos of what we were trying to create.
Well, I think there's a technical mechanism around which this could occur, right? So if you think about how this might work technically, if we have Bitcoin and or some basket of metals, right, then you would want to do something like proving that those things exist and that they're in the right disposition, right? That they can only be borrowed against once. That's the critical thing. Or if they're borrowed against and you allow multiple times, I don't know if we're going to get into some kind of a fractional thing, but that you would have rules set up that would say that the currency has to conform to this shape and size. And that is defined as a smart contract. And in the world of, and it would have a certain constraint upon which it could be minted or created. And that minting or created would be some disposition of Bitcoin into a smart contract that's provable. So you would do that with some official Oracle or data layer or something like that. And that relationship between those two assets would allow you to say, here is the total supply of money that is being created as a result of this debt thing that's happening. And since it's all collateralized, it all has backing, and the backing is presumably going up over time. Like that should be the normal course of things, is that this type of an asset should appreciate. Then those contracts are always redeemable. Like there's not really going to be that much of a situation where you would be underwater on one of those contracts unless the price of the underlying asset substantially went down. Now, usually how something like that occurs is you have some new found trough of gold, or you have substantive sell pressure on something like that, and you have like an asset collapse price. But as far as its algorithmic nature, we haven't really seen a lot of success in those. They usually get destroyed because of bad correlations in the market. But this is what's being discussed, at least by Kennedy, and has already been implemented by Circuit DAO on
And
Chica.
I mean, and also part of the reason that I don't think that they've had success is because they have an absolute fairy tale to compete with. And this is part of what I think that Kennedy and Trump both understand in moving, and part of where I begin to open up to the notion of adding to the backing of the current United States dollar, Bitcoin, because it begins to tie in the crypto world to this notion of an endless supply that we've already become addicted to with regards to the dollar. So, and I think that they're right to begin to rein it in such a way. But again, I worry about the financial industry, or maybe the crypto industry becomes synonymous with the financial industry, but being the outsized winner with regards to that. The other thing
Zooming out for a second, though, when you look at this speech, do you think you read this off the teleprompter?
No, absolutely not. And just
so he riffed for 45 minutes. Just and what took me parsing through it and really understanding all the nuance of what he said, 45 minutes just straight riffing on the state of the world, constitutionality, crypto, Bitcoin, all the salient points of why this stuff works. This guy is sharp as they come. I mean, can you contrast that to the Trump speech? The level of information density isn't even comparable.
I mean, but Donald Trump has also had maybe his greatest political input 100 years from now will be seen as his novel speeches, the way that he's gotten away from this notion of the written speech and a logical structure that in which everything is defendable. I think Trump opened the door for the authenticity that Bobby puts forward, that both of them seem to elicit because they are not reading from a teleprompter.
But the difference between the amount of like pure knowledge coming out of Kennedy's mouth versus Trump's. It, I mean, it's not even comparable.
I don't know, because Trump I'm amazed at sometimes, like, that he, in his mind, he will have a couple of factoids and he drops them together and then ties them with sort of repeating the basic concepts, and also like both Trump and Bobby Kennedy also seem to call out the Winklevoss and Michael Saylor and all these Bitcoin people. They they were there was some heavy petting going on with the Bitcoin audience. So, but let's talk about, because Trump also, the thing that Trump and where I would say Trump and Bobby differed was with regards to um, their, or where they probably highly differ, is their understanding of energy use. Trump ended his speech with basically a discussion of energy policy in the United States, and saying drill baby drill. And not only that, but I would say his energy policy is also going to be, look to our neighbors, Venezuela, and uh, see where we can get a good deal, quote unquote, good deal, with regards to getting more oil back into the United States. And yeah, I thought it was interesting also with regards to what's been happening with the OPEC countries and them getting out from under the thumb and the dictation of the price of oil that the United States has engaged in with their oil. So I don't know, because even Bobby talks about Bitcoin mining at places that have excess methane gas, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's a that I thought that was a very poor understanding of the setup of Bitcoin and the energy consumption that it relies on. And
In the way that you think it's disingenuous that he's saying that it doesn't use a lot of power, or what?
absolutely, absolutely, like disingenuous to the hilt with regards to the reliance on energy consumption, and not only that, but like absolutely ignores the gamification of energy consumption that the Bitcoin relies on. And certainly, it can be different, and we can use proof of work for novel solutions, like going to this software notion of I don't know, that like doing the human genome project with with verification and reliability, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, let's stick on this point for just a second. So this, I think, is the relevant part of the speech, and I'm at a strong disadvantage here to you. Like, I don't mean to like say, "Oh, you're not quite right on that," because like I spent a lot of time thinking about what Bobby Kennedy said and writing it down. So when you do that, you sort of have tactile remembrance of what was said. So he really says that when it comes to Bitcoin energy, it always has to chase the cheapest. Otherwise, it's not going to exist. And so he says that invariably leads most Bitcoin miners to chasing free or waste energy. That definitely resonates with my experiences from talking directly with a lot of people who were mining Bitcoin. And I talked to quite a few of them just because we were at Mining Disrupt, and also because a lot of the people who were mining Bitcoin had some interest in working with Evergreen. So I had a chance to talk with quite a few. I mean, certainly I'm not the world's foremost expert, but I've talked to quite a few. And this is, I was told repeatedly, if you can't get below a certain electrical cost, there's no point in being in the game. And if your price goes above a certain amount, you pretty much have to shut your miners off, or you start losing money very, very quickly, because that's how much electricity it takes to do it. So if your electrical source isn't something that is roughly garbage, then it's almost impossible to make money off of Bitcoin. And he does articulate that pretty well, that that's what you end up chasing, because if your electrical costs you anything what it is like at retail, like 14 cents, you might as well shut them off and just buy Bitcoin versus trying to make money mining it.
And I mean, I agree with all of these statements here, but at the same time, I think that that's a larger conversation that we're having with regards to the price of energy and electricity. And I think that, like, the
Oh, you
understanding
mean
that,
like as the situation in France where you can be overproducing because of nuclear or something like that?
well, and moreover, the situation in Germany that did not make a switch to nuclear and has had to rely on gas from Russia, or the situation in Japan that that had an earthquake that damaged its nuclear plant and has had to change its understandings of where it's going to get its energy from. I mean, like, this notion that there is an excess of energy in the world, sure, in some places, and there are sources of energy that have seemed too pesky and too much trouble to begin to tap. Maybe Bitcoin mining opens up interest in tapping those energy sources, but I think it's something that happens with or without Bitcoin. And so, this understanding that we necessarily have to have a crypto system that is driven by its high energy requirements, or a race against the energy requirements, I think is not true, and was a was an ingenious.
It all depends on how it ends up working, right? If we end up with some army of those Bidax miners that are running off solar panels, then it doesn't matter. And if the majority of the power is coming from sources that are otherwise not going to be used, like we talked about that hydro plant, remember? There's that hydro plant they wanted to bring online, and they said there's no way we can make this economical if we can't sell a certain amount of the power. And the Bitcoin guys said, well, we'll take a certain amount of that power to just make it work, but we'll do it at a discount. It allows you to get the plant online, and we'll take all the extra energy that it's producing, and it's all producing based on hydro. So there would be an example of that. And people have started to count up the electrical sources of Bitcoin because there have been surveys done. Like, there's a way to find out. And it already crossed over. It's like 60% renewable or whatever. And you can actually produce certain coins that are traceable to being sourced by renewable energy.
So, great points, but I think that part of the problem here is that the same people who latch onto the idea of Bitcoin and sovereignty don't want to see a world in which there is one arbiter, a centralized arbiter, as to the price of electricity, and not only that, but what gets made in different areas of the world.
I guess you just have to price it in whatever local currency or whatever, and then you just have to say compare it against global market. I don't know anything else you can do. Maybe there's a different way to think about and reason about it.
Well, and I do love the Bidax miners, and that, as I've said over and over, is the only thing that makes me believe in the possibility of a future of Bitcoin, because I think that thinking of it as a lotto and with minimal inputs of the nodes that are providing for the consensus security is the only way to go. There was something else, though, that I wanted to talk about before, like, we just continue in a circle as to the energy reliance of Bitcoin. Trump also, in his speech, Trump talked about Venezuela too, which also gave me concern.
And Kennedy talked about Bukele or Bukele.
Oh yes, he did mention Bukele, uh, which I commend him for. I think Bukele is doing a great job. Trump didn't bring up Bukele at all, apart from throwing him under the bus last week at the Republican National Convention. I don't know. Well, I guess we'll just have to track it. The other aspect of Trump's speech isn't coming to my mind, and I didn't write it down. Um, but
Here's the section of Kennedy's speech where he talks about El Salvador and Bukele.
yeah, I mean, it's again, I worry about what Bukele is going to do with the country running on the Bitcoin whenever they need to be making their own currency. Like this notion that
Oh, you mean why don't we just use Bitcoin itself and the L2 Lightning to run the entire country?
I mean, if as I've said before, like the United States has gold reserves. Maybe the United States doesn't have gold reserves, and we're merely holding the gold that is actually owned by financial institutions. Okay, if that's the reasoning that we need Bitcoin and we need to reback the dollar with Bitcoin to get away from that, okay, yay, that's great. If we're going to be creating debt and buying millions and millions of Bitcoin and inflating and creating dollars that are worthless and owned by. But what if the losers in that regard are the 401k holders of America? You know, like if we're merely going to be going to tank the dollar in the future, then I I don't know. I have concerns about that. But for those countries of the world that do not ostensibly hold a lot of gold or have gold to back their currency, um, like El Salvador, then acquiring Bitcoin and using that as the basis of their currency is a great idea. But at the same time, if it's the basis of their currency and they don't want to fall prey to corporations that are massively larger than their country or their neighbors, then they need to have some sort of control over prices. And if they're going to have control over prices, then they need either CBDC or a DBDC or a currency. So that they haven't made that move. I mean, I would guarantee that Bukele is thinking about this and has like walked down the path of realization that it takes more than Bitcoin. And
I
like,
guess any country that was operating largely on the US dollar would have been in that exact same situation, right? So for the countries that really didn't have their own currency and just used US dollars, weren't there? I believe there's quite a few countries that do it that way, don't they?
oh
Uh,
yeah, you know,
So
some
I mean, they're all in that exact same boat. You know, it'd be like saying that to say that that model doesn't work, it just means that you're beholden to some other thing. And in the case of Bitcoin, you're not beholden to anything because it's a decentralized global currency. So as far as El Salvador, if Bitcoin wasn't receiving widespread adoption, then their idea might not have worked. But if they're on the right side of that, they're probably sitting on, the reserve of one of the top world powers here. And if Trump is right and Major Lowry is right, then Bitcoin is a power projection mechanism. The countries that adopt it sooner and faster are better off.
well, as long as everybody's following that wave. You know, this puts me in mind of tourism. You know, the tourism industry is changed a lot by the inflation of the dollar. I mean, tourism really blows up as we begin um, massively inflating the the United States dollar against against harder monies. And why is that? Because the velocity of money. If when you're closer to but both the velocity of money and the Cantillon effect, the political faucets from which this created money drips from. So what happens is you have political centers and urban centers where money gets passed around more and a growing supply of money. Like the more transactions you make lead to the perception of wealth, and slower places or places that are farther from that political power have to rely on tourism. What is El Salvador relying on right now? They're relying on tourism. What is Greece doing right now? They're relying on tourism. Or I would
I
say,
don't know. It sounded like Greece is relying on China. That's what it sounded like to me.
well, China understands this, and China has been giving out loans so that they can establish a basis with various countries around the world
For
and to try
sure.
to try.
Whenever you get a debt toehold into a country, that's that's the new imperialism. That's the new colonialism.
Well, but China is also not necessarily going to be asking for the repayment of those debts. What they're going to be asking for is trade contracts going forward.
It's
Because
leverage any which way you slice it. It's the kind of thing where if the borrower is servant to the lender, that's how it goes. If you borrowed a bunch of money, they can start calling it in and causing all kinds of chaos for you. So yeah, they may leverage it and say we're not actually going to ask for it back, but they'll definitely use that threat of not continuing to be so lenient as leverage for whatever it is that they're actually going to try and get in the future.
well, and once you have trade with I don't know, El Salvador making coffee and selling it to another country for some other good, selling it to Nicaragua for swordfish, and Nicaragua selling swordfish to I don't know, Honduras for volcanic ash. I don't know, but once you begin to have those economic systems in place, then those are what truly back a nation's currency, not gold and not Bitcoin. And so in El Salvador can use, and other countries of the world can use Bitcoin to restart their currency. But what they're immediately going to be looking for is to get out of the tourism trap and to be actually producing something of value that they trade with their neighbors. And I've seen Bukele talk a little bit about coffee. But he also, the main thing that he talks about right now is the safety of El Salvador and what a beautiful country it is to visit.
Yeah. Well, we've got just a few minutes left. Do you want to talk SCOTUS, or are we still on this?
Ooh, yes, let's talk SCOTUS.
While I get that queued up, let me just show this. We've got Ron Paul at Bitcoin Nashville. This was pretty neat. I thought this was awesome to see.
I didn't get a chance to listen to this. I'm probably going to listen to it immediately after the show because Ron Paul is my hero, your hero too. I know, and he's probably the one person who could have said anything that I disagreed with, and I still would have just been nodding and pumping my fist. I want to see Ron Paul as the Treasury of the Secretary for whoever gets in office, because he has a deeper understanding than anybody and has thought more about it and led the political charge against the debasement of currency for the longest time.
Right on. Okay. So here is what's being proposed for the SCOTUS. So the reforms that they've talked about are the one that I heard most about was the code of conduct. I heard that. I also heard about something maybe expanding the size of the court, but I guess two other things that are being talked about here are term limits for SCOTUS justices, and then I think this other one is related to immunity. I don't want to see all that SCOTUS though.
I'm laughing because I'm looking at my comment down below. And when do we start calling our president our king? This is the ideas that the executive Joe Biden has proposed with regards to the judiciary would absolutely bring the judiciary under the thumb of the executive, and we should be very, very worried about that, especially with regards to the binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. Well, who would decide that?
A court above the Supreme Court.
Oh, well, that sounds like the Department of Justice. Yay. I'm glad that we've put everything that we've taken the structure put forth to us by the Constitution and recreated it under the thumb of the executive, so that we finally have the monarchy that we were running from to begin with. So I think that we could change and don't necessarily have the federal judiciary that we should have, but our federal judiciary, like our regular justice system, should rely on juries, and maybe those juries should be selected from the members of Congress, from the House and the Senate, or even the state legislatures of states who brought a suit to the federal court. But this notion of a binding conduct for the Supreme Court, or term limits, it speaks to this notion that the law exists and nobody must interpret it. That there is one absolute understanding of the interpretation of the law, and that magically comes from where? Well, it must come from the executive. The number one, no immunity for crimes a former president committed in office, is also yay that the president leads with that, but the immunity that's granted to the president is required for a person who is in that office, and is also limited with regards to acts that are committed in his office. Like the Democratic,
Official, isn't that the
yes,
line?
yes, to the
Official act.
acts. And I think it also, I mean, because they're hand wringing about like the creation of a king, that immunity creates the king, also makes the assumption of that the federal government is in charge of habeas corpus, and they're not. And they are not the only justice system. The states have their own systems of justice, and the powers that are granted to them, the powers over the bodies and the land and the property in the several states. And so these false equations that are made by the president in order to add to the power of the presidency are disgusting, are absolutely disgusting. And I kind of felt bad for Joe Biden in the wake of the uh, the threats. I guess we'll just call it a threat. The threat of the invocation of the 25th Amendment, which I think is despicable and disgusting. Um, but if this is how he sees how the federal government operates and what the role of the president is, then um, he's a terrible president. We do not need people in the office of the president who seek to turn it into a kingdom. And these things would do exactly that. The judiciary was created to be a check on the executive, and we don't need it under the thumb of the executive more. Yes, we could have a greater feedback loop with regards to the quote unquote vox populi, but that should be in the form of federal juries. And this notion that we have juries in our state civil and criminal courts, and yet we don't have them at the federal level, is where we should all be scratching our head and saying, why is that? And what was the original discussion about how the judiciary was supposed to look and perform? Because
Well, this is just like saying that there's got to be some sort of a check and the balance on the Supreme Court, right? There's been discussions and documented evidence with respect to certain of the justices that they've done things that were improper. Well, what's the correct procedure here? I mean, impeachment doesn't seem to be a functional way to mete out justice for somebody that does something wrong when they're Supreme Court justice, right? What do we do? What's the correct redress for the populace? Hanging?
I mean, two things. One, who gets to decide that that's immoral? Especially if the federal government is barred from the establishment of religion. So
well, I wouldn't say immoral. I mean, it would be like, what about Clarence Thomas taking all these kickbacks, going on these billionaire yachts? Like, if that stuff is substantiated, is that improper? Can he take a bunch of gifts in exchange for what seems to be favorable treatment and votes? Let's just presume that it's true, whether it's true or not. Just like, what if that situation was occurring?
Well,
I don't think there's redress. There doesn't seem to be.
I mean, I do believe that it is true, but it's also both a life appointment, and he should be voting his mind and his conscience. And how are we to make
but if his vote is for sale, like, then what do you do?
Well,
somebody who's corrupt.
He might just be enjoying the attentions of
right. I got you, but like, assume it's true. Just forget if it isn't or not. Like, just how do you deal with that situation? Like, I don't think you can.
Then you use the original idea of the notion of adversarial justice, and you make the presumption that the judge is one of the advocates of justice, and we should not put justice into the hand of one advocate, and that justice should be in attention against the advocate for the defense and the advocate for the plaintiff, and that should all be heard in front of a jury of their peers. And there is absolutely nothing in the Constitution that forbids the notion of the juries and the jury system being brought to the federal level. And so if we are
that would be an interesting optic. So you have a Supreme Court justice being hauled into court, and they're on trial, and they have a jury of their peers, which I guess would be some federal court judges.
Well, no, this isn't to bring, this isn't to call to stand before the court a judge, but we should be removing from them this notion that they decide. Why where in the understanding of the history of the United States, of our notions of self-expression and self-reliance, did we ever like backtrack into the notion that one person made the decision, or to broaden that out to a panel of judges isn't that much better? And I don't care how.
When I said panel of judges, I was saying that with respect to who would be their peers, who would actually appear as that jury. Who's the jury of the peers of one of the Supreme Court justices? Who could it be that would be peers?
Well, when I say a jury, the jury should be considering the matters that are brought before the Supreme Court. Like this notion that a judge should be bound to a code of conduct. I don't even agree with the bar associations and their code of ethics at all.
Well, that gets to be a pretty big topic that we could probably spend some time talking about, but I think we're at the top of the hour.
I'll just say when you make a code of conduct and you make those rules for those people who can engage in a guild, then we're going against the grain and the thread that all Americans are equal, that all citizens are equal and had access to not only justice but the various sectors of employment. And
I mean, we almost got away from that the minute we started making lawyers officers of the court. Like as soon as we did that, we sort of created a second class of citizens that exists in the United States.
I mean, amen. And we have to go back to Oliver Ellsworth and James Madison. And I mean, the encroachment of the legal profession on the judicial system was not just immediate, but it had already begun at the time of the Constitutional Convention. Even like these notions and understandings of the justice system and the court system were carried over from England and from the various places that people came from. So you could talk about the political rules of writing something down and legislation and how people follow authority and apply that legislation, but it's always a much stickier situation whenever you delve into what's actually happening and call that the law. But yeah, I enjoyed it today. I don't know. We're at the top of the hour. Let's end it here, and we'll pick up this bone that I love to chew on at some point, probably over and over in future episodes.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.